Okay. Hi guys. This is Tanya, and today we're gonna be talking about how to ask good cross-ex questions, specifically questions that help either set up an argument for you, answer one of your opponent's arguments, or just makes your opponent look bad. Now, what specifically makes a cross-examination question good? A good cross-ex question gets you a good answer, and it doesn't just doesn't just happen to get you a good answer. A good cross-ex question really only has one answer. So either your opponent says that answer and they look bad because that answer is bad for them, or they don't read that answer and they look a little bit ridiculous because they're not admitting the obvious truth. So with that said, there is a kind of a central guiding rule when it comes to asking cross-ex questions, which is you should have an answer in mind when asking any question, and not just have an ideal answer that you want, but an answer they have to give you, right? You could think oh, I want them to say that the disad turns the af. That doesn't mean they're gonna say that, right? It has to be something that they have to say. So you don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. And this is why some questions might be good in some contexts and not in others. Let's say that you have a counterplan that you want to read, and you're gonna ask the affirmative how the counterplan doesn't solve for the af. Why wouldn't this counterplan solve for the af? If your counterplan 100% solves for the af, then that's a good question, because they're not going to have an answer. They're either going to have to say, yeah, that would solve, or say nonsense. Either case, that's good for you. But if the counterplan doesn't solve for the af, or if there's even a reasonable argument they could make that it doesn't solve the af, even if you could still win on that counterplan at the end of the debate, if they can make a reasonable argument in cross-examination that it doesn't necessarily solve the af, that looks bad. Same way, assuming that this isn't a clarification, assuming you do understand how the disad works, asking how a disad links to the af can be a very good question if the disad in literally no way links to the af. But if it does link to the af, then that's a bad question, because now you've just given your opponent free time to talk. And if you were being super indignant about it, how does this even link to the af, and they give you an answer, then you actively look bad. You didn't just give your opponent free time. You look ridiculous. So with that said, there's kind of a prerequisite to being able to ask good cross-ex questions, and that's you don't have to be amazing at refutation, right? You don't need to be the greatest MG of all. You don't need to be a god tier line by line debater, but you have to, at least when you start start cross-ex, have some questions in mind that you want to ask. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of impossible. And I think another thing that's very helpful here is having a good understanding of what an af or neg case should look like. Because a lot of very good cross-ex questions are just pointing out things that are objectively wrong with their case, right? If they don't have uniqueness, that just is incorrect, right? And you can ask in cross-ex, hey, where's your uniqueness? And if they just don't have it, then they have to kind of just flail around trying to come up with some sort of non-answer, or they have to admit that they're reading a linear disad or advantage, right? So having an understanding of how arguments should look makes it much easier to ask good questions. Some other rules for being good at cross-examination is that you're not actually arguing in cross-ex, you're just asking questions. You're trying to set up arguments for later. There are ways for you to effectively just completely take out a position if it's really bad in cross-ex. Again, it would have to be a very poorly constructed position, but you can, right, if it's really bad. But you have to do that with questions, right? You have to let your opponent explain why it doesn't make sense, which is why these questions have to be very pointed. Second, the more objectively correct you are, the more obvious you can be in your questioning. So let's say, we'll get to that in a second actually. And the ACE point of that, that's also when you can be a little bit more like aggressive about it. And then third, you shouldn't be afraid to ask follow-up questions. And actually, asking follow-up questions is very important. Rule number 1, don't argue during cross-ex, you're just not allowed to. So, rule number 2, the more correct you are, the more obvious the argument you're starting up can be, and the more indignant you can act. I would say a lot of very good, effective cross-examination questions are not super like tricky in that you're trying to like mislead your opponent somehow. I feel like a lot of good cross-ex questions are questions you ask or someone asks, and people who are watching the round instinctively know what the answer is and know that that answer is bad for your opponent. Right, and there's ways that you can ask cross-ex questions that just kind of make your opponent seem like they don't know what they're talking about or specifically set up arguments you want to make. But I think some of the most like very devastating cross-ex questions are ones where you ask the question and everyone knows the answer already. And it doesn't really matter what your opponent says. It's not looking good. Like there's not a good way to answer that question. A lot of like trickier questions, there's a way that they could potentially answer it well. It's a very good cross-ex question if they just can't answer it in a good way. Rule number 3 is you want to use follow-up questions to emphasize the parts of their answers that you like. Now let's say, we'll go back to I think we talked about it a second ago. Let's say that you know that their disad doesn't link to the AF at all. And you ask, how does this disad link to the AF? And they restate whatever convoluted tag they gave you in their speech. You don't want to then go, okay, let's move on, right? You want to keep asking follow-up questions until they either explicitly state there is not a link or it is very obvious to anyone who's watching that there is not a link, right? Either this person is like lying through their teeth or they don't really understand how the position functions. And that's a situation where next speech you can get up and be like, hey, I'm not even going to answer this. This doesn't link. Right? If you think that that's viable post-cross-ex. A bonus tip is that when you're done with your line of questioning, you should always end by saying, perfect, thank you. Or that's great, thank you. Perfect, thank you so much. Something like that. It just kind of messes with people. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Even if you're asking a clarifying question, you should finish by saying, okay, awesome, thank you. That's perfect. Oh. It's supposed to be hidden. Pretend that you're not seeing this. This is very embarrassing. Guys, give me just 1 second. I should edit this out, but I don't know how. So you're going to pretend that you're not seeing any of this. And this is going to be so cool too. I was like, oh, this is so professional looking. Maybe I will find a way to edit this out. If not, this is incredibly humiliating. Okay, cool. So this is the first time you're seeing this page. We're going to look at a little example advantage, and we're going to try and convert some arguments that we want to make in the next speech into cross-ex questions. So for this, I just used the current PF topic, or the February, I don't know if it'll be current when it'll probably be current still. The PF topic is the USFG should ban all single-use plastic. So the advantage goes, and this isn't necessarily like for PF, I'm just using the resolution, right? This is not how he would structure a case necessarily, but okay. Advantage 1, uniqueness, climate change is bad in the SWO, ACE point, plastics increase, I just put random numbers, they increase the amount of methane. B point, climate change will be irreversible by 2040, Linkous plan passes, all single-use plastic is banned, this spills over to other stuff, internal link, single-use plastic ban is key to decreasing emissions. So, our rules will kind of help us determine how to make something into a good question. So let's say first argument we want to make is that there are other causes to climate change. Right? This is pretty objectively true. So first we want to make sure we're saying it as a question. So instead of just saying there are all causes to climate change, we would say, is single-use plastic the only cause? And we know they have to say no, or they look ridiculous. Right, and we might want to ask some follow-up questions here too, because while this does kind of like set up our argument for us, it doesn't like perceptually look amazing, right? It doesn't look bad, but there's more you could do. You could say like, so if there's other causes, how are you able to solve for the affirmative? And they're going to have an answer, right? Most likely. Maybe they don't, but if this is a case they've been reading for a while, like if it isn't like Parley or something where this is the first time they've read it, they're probably going to have some kind of answer. But again, we're emphasizing the parts of the answer that we like. So even when they give their kind of like qualifying statement where they're like, well, we made that argument that saying use plastics are key for this reason, whatever, you can just say like, okay, but you say that 15% of emissions come from plastics in general. You're not solving for 85% of emissions, so how are you supposed to win on solving climate change when there's literally no conceivable way you can solve for climate change? Right? As you move on in your questioning, you can get to that kind of, where is it? Isn't it true that, wouldn't you agree with arguments where you're essentially just saying the argument you want to say and starting with, isn't it true that, right? If you just immediately go, isn't it true that there's no way you can solve for climate change? Probably going to say no. It's probably a bad question. But if you start off by saying, are there other causes to climate change, which is a pretty objective question, and you follow up by saying, well, how do you solve for climate change? And they give some kind of answer, but then you follow up again by saying, well, there's all this other stuff, so how can you actually solve? You can't actually solve. It looks a lot better. Even if they don't answer, that's the thing. It's like, if it's like the third or fourth follow-up question, you can kind of just move on, even if they don't answer, right? It's not really about the judge hearing them explicitly say it at that point. It's implied. Now, let's say that we're not just setting up the argument ourselves, we're referencing something in the case, right? There's a problem with the case. In this situation, the problem with their case is that their own card is saying that there's other causes to climate change, other significant causes. And this is something that'll happen a lot. And a rule of thumb I like to recommend is, in this situation, you just have your opponent read the part of the card that contradicts what they're going to say. And the worse it looks for them, the more hesitant, resistant they're going to be to just read that part out loud. They're probably going to try and say like, oh, well, you're taking it out of context, or we have this other evidence, or whatever. Doesn't matter. You don't want to talk about that stuff because you don't know about that stuff. That's like an unknown variable, right? What you know is this card says this thing that's good for you. That's what you want to kind of focus your energy on, right? You want them to read that card because, again, this is something that's very obvious and straightforward. You don't really need to like strong arm them in any way. It's just what the card says. And I think that's what is part of a lot of like very elegant and effective cross-ex questions, is it's you're not even trying to be tricky. It just is, there just is something wrong. Similarly, this is also pretty common. I don't know that I'm teaching you guys anything when I say this, but if the card doesn't say something that it's supposed to say, as opposed to saying something good for you, it just is mistagged in some way, you could say, what line of the card says this? Now, the important thing is, again, you don't want to derail. You don't want to start talking about other things. The question is, what line of the card says this thing? If they start talking about, like, their explanation of how the argument functions, you don't want that. You want to just talk about that specific card, because you know that specific card doesn't say what it's supposed to say. Similarly, if they say, oh, well, I have this other evidence I can read you in whatever speech, you can say, no, that's fine. I'm wondering about this card. Because you don't know about the evidence. You have no idea what it's going to say. Maybe you do. Maybe you've gotten whatever front lines they have before you like know what they're going to say. But still, that's not what you're talking about. The point is, their card does not say what they say it says, and that's what you want to really drive home for the judge. And that's the thing, is that you really want to emphasize the good answers that you get. Right? Make it like very obvious, especially if someone's like half paying attention. Right? Now, let's say that we are trying to kind of get at a question that's an answer that isn't super duper obvious, right? Like we're making an argument in the next speech that the status quo is solving for climate change. We probably are not going to be in a situation where we just say, like, is the status quo solving for climate change? And they have to say yes. They're probably going to say no. And the judge is probably going to be like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So instead, this is a situation where we want to kind of, like, for a lack of better words, strong arm our opponent into giving us the answer that we want. So instead of making it really obvious that we're going for a non-unique, we want to try and go kind of the opposite direction. So we might say something like, is it even possible to solve for climate change? How can we possibly solve for climate change? It seems like your uniqueness is making it seem like we really can't solve climate change. And so now you are still pointing out like a hypothetical flaw with their case. It doesn't really exist. Maybe it does. But I mean, if you're reading a non-unique, it probably doesn't. So you're hoping to get your opponent to do what they would do in a situation where there like really was a flaw, right? Try and explain like, no, you don't understand. Like it actually is fine. It works. We can solve for climate change. There's all these ways we can solve. And then you ask, how can we solve? Look at all these other causes for climate change. Your own card says there's other causes. How could you possibly solve for climate change? There's literally no way when all this other stuff is happening. And what's tricky about questions like this, right, is there's really 3 answers they can give. We don't want that. We want there to be one answer. But you can still kind of guide them in the direction that you want them to go. So the 3 answers they could give are, 1, you're right, we don't solve, which, I mean, I guess still is good. Like, it's still, like, pretty fairly terminal defense on the advantage. Second, they could be kind of like neutral about it, like say, yeah, we don't solve for all of climate change, but we still solve a lot, and that's still a really positive impact. Right, it's a necessary first step. And 3, we do solve for climate change because that other stuff you're talking about is being resolved for already. And that third answer is kind of what we want. We want them to argue that some kind of status quo initiative is happening that is beneficial, and you want to keep kind of pushing them to that direction. Keep asking like, well, how do you solve for these all causes? How do you solve for these all causes? And then eventually, when they do argue there's like status quo efforts to solve for climate change, you can go, so why do we even need the AF? And then they start answering and you go, no, that's fine. I actually have another question. So you cut them off. Let's say you can never get them to that point, which is possible. Then you just say don't solve. Opposite way, right? You say the uniqueness overwhelms the links. Right, not a terrible position to be in, and it can still work, right, if your opponent kind of like freaks out. The only thing that's dangerous with these like long questions, like these long chains of questions that you can ask, is there is the very real possibility that they don't answer the way that you want them to answer, like 3 questions down. And 2, if they are, this is a situation where like them being good at cross-text question answering will be helpful for them, right? Them being good at answering cross-text questions doesn't necessarily help them if you're asking them to read a line of their card that is bad. It can help them if you're trying to get them to admit that they don't have uniqueness, when they do have, arguably at least, uniqueness. If they don't actually have uniqueness, then again, that's kind of like a situation where it's like, oh, what can you do? Now, let's say that you are going to introduce some new evidence in your next speech. Let's say you're going to read either a counterplan or a SQUO solves argument about some bill. We'll call it Bill XYZ, and you're saying that that will solve for the AF. Now, here is what you're not going to do. You're not going to say, are you aware of Bill XYZ? Do you know about this specific law? Did you know that this person is going to do this thing? Because they're either going to answer, yeah, I did know that, which doesn't look amazing for you if you do know that, because that does kind of imply that they consider that, or they're going to say, no, I didn't know that, which still isn't like amazing for you, because now you have to do explaining in cross-text and you're not asking questions, you're making statements, which, right, that's breaking rule number 1, you're arguing when you should be asking questions. So instead, what can be helpful in a situation like this where you want to bring up some external event, some external thing, is instead of saying, did you know about this thing? You can instead sort of summarize what the thing is and then kind of get at what your question is, right? So Bill XYZ means we recycle things better, right? That means that these bad effects of single-use plastics being loose everywhere don't happen. Why doesn't this solve for the F? Now, this is only a good question if, one, it does solve for the F, which I don't know that this does, because you're still producing new plastic. But two, you know they don't know how to answer the question. So it can still be a good question if there is conceivably a good answer, as long as you know they won't have it. Maybe this is like a brand new argument. Maybe they've seen it before and every time they've answered it badly, you know that they're going to answer this question poorly. It can still be a good cross-text question, even if there is potentially an all right answer to it. Case by case. So that card doesn't say. So last, we're going to talk about, here, this is going to be our last example. So we read our non-unique earlier. Now we want to read a turn. We want to say they don't ban other plastics. This leads to those other plastics filling in, which leads to an increase of emissions overall, because those other plastics are worse for XYZ reason. This is another situation where this could be a good question or it could be a bad question, depending on how much you know about the topic and how much your opponent knows about the topic, right? If their case is written very well, if they have like spikes and preempts to this stuff about plastics, or you know they have like really good front lines answering this, don't know that this is an amazing cross-text question, and you might want to cut off your questioning a little bit earlier than this full like scenario, right? You might just want to say you only ban single-use plastics, right? So you don't ban any other plastics. All those other plastics can still be used. So you're going to say yes, otherwise they're untopical. And when it's kind of whole lot res like this, questions like this aren't as important, right? Because they're obviously untopical if they're not doing what the res says. But if there is kind of wiggle room for what their plan does or doesn't do, you still want to kind of get like this kind of, not even like clarifying question, but just kind of setting a baseline for what the AF is defending, or the neg, depending, like maybe if it's like a counterplan or something. But even if it is kind of like a whole lot res, I think it can be helpful sometimes to start with you only ban single-use plastics, right? Because it gets a very simple yes or no answer out of them, right? There's not really a way for them to spin that in any way, right? They have to give you the answer that you want, which I feel like sets a good tone for the rest of the question. So let's say you do have good evidence and their case is written poorly. You know that you're gonna get answers that are good for you out of this person for whatever reason. Maybe they're just bad at answering questions. Maybe they have a poor, whatever. You know you're going to get good answers. Then you can keep going. Instead of saying you only ban single-use plastic, so other forms of plastic still exist, perfect, move on. Instead, you're going to say, so post-AF, companies can switch to regular plastic, right? So they could just make their stuff out of regular plastic instead. And really two answers they can make to this, right? They could say yes, or they could say no. Or I guess no and yes, that's the order that it is. And, right, this is kind of a red flag for us if we don't immediately know what their answer is going to be. So if I was in this round and I didn't know how they were going to answer this question, I would probably dip a little bit earlier. But let's say there's a situation where you could still proceed here even if you don't know if they're going to say yes or no, and that's if the event is carded and there's no kinds of like spikes or preempts in this advantage about like fill-in, reusable plastic fill-in, and their evidence doesn't explicitly say single-use plastic is better than reusable plastic, just that there's more single-use plastic, right? In that case, it doesn't really matter what they say. And it kind of comes back to, instead of really setting up the turn, just kind of indicting their evidence, right? So let's say they say no, you ask why not, they give some reason, right? You don't know the reason, but it doesn't matter because your next question is going to be, where does it say in the card and they're not going to have an answer. So ultimately, you are getting your like moment or whatever. Alternatively, they say, yes, you do switch to reusable plastic, but reusable plastic is better. Then you can point out, oh, but your card doesn't say that it's better, it says some other thing. And then right, there's nothing they can really say to that. And again, you want to make sure you're asking it as a question, right? This is still technically a question. There's a little bit of a statement at the beginning, but you end up with a question, because otherwise they get to say, I'm not sure what the question is, which is generally bad for us. So you might be wondering at this point, like, why does it matter that much if I ask a question? Like, if I ask, right, this question, and either they do have some sort of evidence, or like it's not a carded event and they can like kind of come up with an explanation in cross-ex. Why does it matter, right? They're going to make that argument eventually. The reason you don't want them to explain why your turn doesn't work, even if like it's not like a GG game over answer to your turn, is that now it's going to be like, one, it's like weird in your speech. You have to like read your turn and then preempt what they're going to say, and it's just, I don't know, I'm not, it's weird. But two, it just doesn't look good. It doesn't look good in cross-ex because you can't like answer what they're saying. You don't get to argue back. You just ask questions. So either you ask the question, they read their response to the turn, and then you start making statements in response, and now you look back because you're arguing in cross-ex, or two, you don't have any follow-up question to respond to that, and now, at least for this moment, they are already ahead on your turn before you get into your speech. And that's bad. We don't want that. So don't ask questions you don't know the answer to. Don't give them free time to just bolster their case. Why do that? Okay, that's pretty much it. I hope this was helpful. If it wasn't, yikes. That sucks. Yeah, if you have questions, you can ask in the comments. Someone will answer them. I don't know if it'll be me, but someone's going to answer them for sure. They'll get answered.